Welcome once again to Arctic Fire. This unique gathering of swordsmiths explores the outer edge of the craft, where craftsmanship, artistry, storytelling, history, and myth combine. This year, the group has recreated objects found in the legendary Hoard of Grendel, from the most ancient surviving poem in Old English, Beowulf. 4 days of live broadcast, in which legends will be reborn. Arctic Fire 2016, Grendel's Hoard.
So this is the hilt from the giant sword in the poem Beowulf. And we started out that we were going to make artifacts from Grendel's hoard, which is this hoard of treasure that Beowulf encounters when he goes down to slay Grendel's mother, who is basically a troll or a giant monster in the poem. And so we decided that we were going to make artifacts, and Owen and I were interested in making the Sword of Giants. And then we had this interesting thing happen that Peter has explained, where we were contacted by an anonymous person who had access to this series of images and drawings from a collection of this guy named Winter, Gotthard Winter, yeah. So among the things, there was a photograph of hilt, which is it's partially in the ground, and it has a yardstick next to it, so you can see how big it is. But you can't really tell in the photograph at first how big it is. It just looks like a Viking hilt with interesting ornamentation. But it turns out in Gotthard's notes, it was actually found at this place called Lejre in the gardens in like the 1930s. There was a police investigation in this place, and they found, because they had found human remains, so they'd found a skull, and I guess he found out about it, and this is in Denmark, and he went to the police after he found out about it, and he wasn't able to get the skull or the hilt that was found with it, but he got a photograph of it. So, and after the Nazi occupation of Denmark, there was nobody found the actual artifacts. But he has this photograph that looks real, and it's really interesting. So this is where it was found, and this is actually, Lejre Castle is right next to Lejre, and this is Lejre, and this is where later on they actually found what might actually be the historical Hall of Heorot, that is the hall in Beowulf. So this is the photograph, and it's like, it looks, to me, I see that right away and can recognize Salen ornamentation, which is a kind of migration period ornamentation, but it's a hilt that looks more kind of Viking age. But when you look at it more closely, it's really big. It's way bigger than a hilt. Each of these represents a centimeter, so this is like quite large. And Peter found this pressblack, and he found the drawing of it first, and then found the pressblack, which has a hilt very similar to this and the same size, that's depicting Beowulf killing Grendel's mother. So this is kind of incredible and amazing. So now I'm just going to look at the poem. So there are a few references to this giant sword. You have Beowulf, when he describes having slayed the mother of Grendel, he says, "But the Lord of Men allowed me to behold an ancient sword shining on the wall, a weapon made for giants, there for the wielding." And this is when he's gone down and he's fought with Grendel's mother, and she's stabbing him with this huge knife that Peter has made a reconstruction of, but his mail protects him, and his sword doesn't work against her. He breaks his sword. So he sees this huge sword on the wall, and in the actual description of it in the poem, it says, "Then he saw a blade that boded well, a sword in her armory, an ancient heirloom from the days of the giants, an ideal weapon, one that any warrior would envy, but so huge and heavy of itself, only Beowulf could wield it in battle. So the Shielding's hero, hard-pressed and enraged, took a firm hold on the hilt and swung the blade in an arc." And he kills Beowulf's mother with this huge sword. But it's a sword that only Beowulf can wield. It's so big, and it was forged by giants, for giants. So it's huge, but it's still at a kind of a human scale, because even though Beowulf is basically a superhero, he's still able to use it. So it can't be like 40 feet long. And in my research about this particular little tiny piece of the poem, there's a book called The Sword in Anglo-Saxon England by H.R. Ellis Davidson, and she devotes a page to the word fettle hilt, which means essentially, fettle means belt, and to describe a hilt as being a belt hilt doesn't really make sense. You'd think it would be a description that you would apply to a scabbard. But she thinks it actually refers to a type of sword in a story. So she says it is possible that this unique term, fettle hilt, is not a descriptive one, but one arising from a traditional element in the story, though its significance is no longer apparent in the poem as we have it. So this actually, what she's suggesting is that this actually might be a sword that's an archetype in other stories and in earlier stories. And if you look at other stories from Northern Europe and Britain, there are a couple examples that are similar. There's the sword in the stone, which is a bound sword that only a specific hero can withdraw, who has, in that case, it's that he's going to be the king. There's also grammar in the Sigurd story that is stuck in a tree by Odin, and only the right person can draw it. So it's this sword that only a specific hero can wield it. And in this case, even if fettle hilt doesn't mean a bound hilt, it's still a sword that only Beowulf can use. So it still fits into this kind of archetypal sword. And there's also a really interesting relation between the sword and the sword in the lake from Arthurian legend, which is that the Lady of the Lake offers a sword to Arthur, and the sword is connected to his heroism and sacral kingship and stuff. But in this story, Beowulf goes down into a lake and encounters a supernatural female, and there's a magical sword involved. So there's actually, I think, reference to probably an earlier story that connects the lake with the sword and the hero. And I think also this is maybe a lake offering, because why would there be a bunch of treasure in the bottom of a lake? And in early Germanic culture and in the ancient Celtic culture, they would offer these amazing, beautiful things into lakes. So I think that the giant sword actually represents the sword of the ancestors. And the ancestors were often described as being huge giants. They were because the past was this time of immensity and the kind of golden age that people looked back to for to justify themselves as part of an elite. And then, so for a description of the hilt, what happens is Beowulf kills Grendel's mother, he cuts off Grendel's head, and he returns to the surface of the lake with the hilt and the head, and leaves all the treasure behind. And he gives it to Hrothgar the king. And Hrothgar, describing the hilt, says, he examined the hilt, that relic of old times. It was engraved all over and showed how war first came into the world in the flood, destroying the tribe of giants. And so, on this hilt that we have a photograph of, which is actually 10 inches wide. If you look at you translate the centimeters into inches, that's a 10-inch wide object. This actually, I've just drawn over it so you can see it. This is a head. This is very similar to there are Anglo-Saxon horns that have this Salen-style ornamentation on them, and this is a common motif of a helmeted head. That's the eye, and that's the nose guard, and then an arm with a hand and a thumb right there. But in this case, it's all kind of deconstructed into these swirls, and I think that right here, this is another arm, and I think this is actually a giant being pulled apart in a flood, because this is the drowning giant hilt. It just makes sense. You could have, that's an arm there, this is water swirling, and then a giant. So having reconstructed this, I can just flip it and have what the other side of the hilt looked like. So now I have a reconstruction of a hilt for a giant sword, and it's basically exactly twice the size of a normal sword. So this is what it would have looked like, maybe. There's Grendel's head, the sword, and now we're into the realm of complete make-believe. as far as my interpretation of this sword. I'm extrapolating on the hilt, I'm extrapolating on the jewels, and what I'm doing with this is I'm imagining that it's a hilt made by giants. I'm looking at it from the poem's perspective rather than an actual historical perspective. Giant objects in Europe that were made in the Bronze Age, but there's nothing else this big from this period, so I have no idea what the actual hilt was for. But I'll leave that up to you to speculate. So I've designed this pommel to kind of match this, and I've set jewels. I've designed it so that it has jewels because there was a space for jewels. And if this was designed by a giant, I thought, well, the jewels that a giant would hold sacred would be things like the bones of Ymir, who is in giant mythology. Ymir is the original giant who the world was made out of. He basically, and he was fed by a cow named Abdomla. So this is in the very beginning of the world. And then he gave birth to giants and gods out of his various body parts. Like, I don't know, out of his ear and elbow, gods and giants started coming out. And then the gods who came out killed him and made the world out of his body, the sky as his skull, and his blood drowned the giants. And that actually may be the flood that is being referred to in this, rather than the biblical flood. It may be the slaying of Ymir, drowning all the giants, and only one giant survived, and his name was Bergelmir, and he is the progenitor of the entire race of giants. So this hilt actually might be a memorial to that event. And so set in the hilt are bones of Ymir, which are iron, and bones of Adomla, which is the cow. So there's a cow bone set in the hilt, and cow horn. So that's my design. And then once Owen and I started going on this, we imagined that if this is the sword of the giants, it must have many names. It must be incredibly ancient. So we came up with sewer is the Indo-European word for sword, but we speculated that probably the word sewer actually came from the original name of this sword, since it was probably like the proto-sword that all other swords came from. And then, because it's connected with flood, we speculated other names for the sword would be flood, deluge, giant stands shouting at the sea. That's a translation from a petroglyph. Breakwater, water breaker, tribe's end, storm hate, sea fury, never drowned, sea sleeper. So there are hundreds of names of this sword. And right here you have a little design for how I designed the pommel, the upper guard for the sword. I think that the giants who drowned actually are the progenitors of giant squid. And when you look at the ornamentation, the giant is actually turning into a squid here on the pommel. So, but we can't really know if that's true or not. So, but now we're looking at the scale of the thing. So we have this hilt. This is actually from an illuminated manuscript from like the 13th century, I think, right? And it's a giant who's getting slayed by a knight. And you can see he took him out by cutting his ankle, so he fell down and then hit him in the head. But he has a giant knife, and he's about twice the size of the knight. So he's like about the right size for a hilt of this size. So I drew a giant. What would a giant be? So if you have a giant standing next to a man, then the giant's twice the size of a man. A man's sword is about 3 feet long from during the kind of period of the migration period or the Viking Age. So if you scale that up, that's how big the sword is. It's 6 feet long, and that's actually the size of the hilt. That's a 10-inch wide hilt. So that's our scale, and then I did some sketches of what a giant would look like next to a human warrior. So now I'm going to talk about the actual making of the hilt, how I made it. I decided that for something this big, what I needed to do was make it out of plasticine and make one half, and then make a mold of the half, and then cast them. So because it's actually a really big thing to carve and quite intricate. So I used this stuff called monster clay and just built it up over a wooden model. And when we were doing this, we were on a time frame. So Owen is in England and I'm in Canada, and I had to make it simultaneously to him making the blade. So we decided the blade should be 6 inches wide to fit the hilt. And I made a wooden model of half the blade to make half the hilt, and then modeled it on a piece of glass so that I had a really smooth background. And here I'm just drawing, I just draw the design on by hand. And just do it by eye, looking at the drawing of the hilt that I did. And you can see I kind of screwed up and had to readjust where it was. So then I cut, once I've got them scratched on, I cut them in deeper and then start removing material until I have the pattern that I want. So it's kind of the thing that's interesting about working with clay compared to wax or wood is that it's not only a reductive carving process, you can actually add stuff to it, but mostly I just kind of take stuff away. That's how I'm used to carving. So, and this is a neat material to work with because you can soften it and harden it, so you can make it harder for moving the material around, and you can press things into it to get patterns. So then here's the half of a hilt ready, and all I have to do here now is just cut the jewel in. And there you go. And so here you can see the pattern. You can see the head. I don't know if you can see that. There's an eye there, and that's the nasal of some kind of helmet, and then the arm, and then the swirling water, and then another arm. And there now I'm going to start doing the pommel. And I do exactly the same process again with the pommel. Carve it in. And then you have the squid giant mid-transformation. And so then the next thing I do is I mix up rubber mold solution, and I make a little box around the model and just pour the rubber mold solution in. And it's just a 2-part solution, and then it hardens and sets, and you have this very malleable mold that's the opposite shape of the thing I carved. So once I have that, I melt wax. So I have heated up wax, and I pour it into the mold, and it takes the exact shape of the model that I made. And then once that cools, I'll take 2 halves of that and weld them together and do the final carving and fitting on the actual wax. And that way I don't have to carve the intricate pattern twice. And then I fit that to an actual full-size model of the hilt, which I then sent to Owen. So now I'm actually making, these are sprues, and these are the place, when this heats up, I'll make a mold around this. This will heat up, and the wax will all melt out, and then I'll turn it upside down and pour bronze into the mold. So I'm painting on a solution to keep bubbles from developing on the surface when I pour stuff in. These are the mold casings, and you see I have those in there with screws in there to keep the mold from sliding out of the casing. And now I mix a solution of, it's called investment powder, but it's basically plaster and silicon powder. So I mix that together, and I pour it into the mold casing over the wax model, and when it hardens, it goes in as a liquid and just covers everything. When it hardens, the model is completely trapped in a very hard, kind of concrete-like surface. And then I take that and I heat it up to like 1400 degrees. All the wax melts out, and then I'm melting bronze to pour into it. So the mold is in the oven. I'm heating up the bronze. And the bronze melts, well, I pour it at like 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. So inside there, I have this big, and I'm melting bronze in there and heating up. This is an ingot that I'm heating up to put in the bronze, because if you put the ingot in when it's cold, the liquid bronze that's already in there will explode. So you can see I'm being a little bit careful about it. And we've had that happen with aluminum, where an aluminum thing, all the liquid aluminum flew up in the air. But this time it was warm enough so it didn't blow molten bronze everywhere. That's a mistake you only make once. So now I have the crucible is inside the foundry furnace, and we're picking it up. This is me and my father. And it's about 80 pounds of bronze, and I think it's maybe 150 pounds when you add the crucible in. And you can just lift those tongs, and they close over the crucible. So now I'm scraping off any kind of impurities that have fallen into the bronze, and making sure that it's nice and clean. And when you look in there, it's hard to photograph, but when you look in there, it's all these beautiful iridescent colors swirling around on the surface of this glowing liquid with a consistency not that different than water. So then I put this little clip on here so you can, so it doesn't fall off when I tip it. And now I'm going to pour. You can see the molds, they have the negative space that was inhabited by the wax model. And I just pour the molten bronze in there, and it fills up the mold. And these molds are 700 degrees so that the bronze stays warm once it gets in there, so it can kind of suck into all of the little spaces and fill it up. So there they are, sitting inside the molds. They're still red hot, maybe even a little bit liquid inside. So I let them cool down till the sprue caps, which are these open parts at the top, are black, but they're still very hot. And I put on a pair of gloves and pick them up, and you can see there's smoke coming off of that. That's my glove burning, because that's still quite hot. And now I'm going to take it and quench it in water, and this will break away the investment material. So it's a lot easier to get the bronze out. And this is a big piece of bronze, so this whole bucket of water boiled from the bronze when I put it in there. So you can see that how much water is gone. That's me getting splashed with boiling water and investment. So there, now I have a bronze model, and you can see the sprues are all bronze now, and the object is in the center is bronze. And it fills up everywhere there was wax with bronze, and now I have these bronze fittings with all this stuff on it that I have to cut off, and I've got to now finish the bronze, which is still a fairly lengthy process. And then also I'm hoping that it is going to fit on the blade, because bronze shrinks slightly, and I haven't actually met the actual blade. I've just made this for a piece of wood. So Owen is making the sword. Sorry. So then the next thing I do is I cut the sprues off with a big angle grinder. And this is a little finicky because you don't want to slip and damage your bronze object that you've just invested weeks of carving into. So once you get all of the sprues off, then I'll take that model and sandblast it and polish it and get it ready to patina. So basically my idea with this is I think that the giant sword should be green, both aesthetically because it's connected with water and also because it's an old thing. So now I'm going to recreate this thing called verdigris, which is what happens to bronze when it's exposed to weather for a long time. And you'll see bronze artifacts in museums are these incredible colors. They're like aquamarine blue and leaf green. And you can recreate this. You can basically speed up the chemical process that happens through oxidization on bronze by heating it and applying things like ammonia and cupric nitrate, which is like some kind of a copper chemical. And it slowly turns a beautiful green color. And that process is kind of interesting and fun. And you can also turn it black or red. There's almost no color you can't turn bronze. And then so there you have it. It's green now. And you keep heating it up. So you get the bronze up to like about 250 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you touch it with water, it just kind of evaporates. And then you have your bronze hilt. And then I decided, so there's your hilt getting ready it's still kind of curing and turning green at this point. And then I have my space here that I'm going to put the jewels in. So here's one of the iron. This is a piece of wrought iron that I set in silver that I'll put into the hilt. So that's a piece of Ymir's bones. And then that's a piece of Adumla, the cow. Then I actually made it out of a piece of cow bone that I found in the field that had been gnawed by brush wolves, I think. So it had all sorts of teeth marks. So there are the hilt pieces. And there it is. That's how it was when I was finished. I had the piece of wood, and then I packed it and brought it here, and Owen and I spent 4 or 5 hours grinding the fittings and to fit them onto the blade. And now we've got it fit, and it's just about ready to put together. So that's my presentation.
We have several comments.
Okay.
No questions I've seen. Lots of, wow, sweet, oh God, check that out.
OMG.
One interesting comment from Nick. All the imagery of water, feminine spirits, and magic swords is very suggestive.
Okay.
I'm not sure what that means. Nick, it might be you. Might be you.
I don't know. Yeah. So you guys have any questions? Owen.
I do. I'm just interested because obviously I've been working on a blade without hilt fittings.
Yeah.
How you felt making hilt fittings without a blade, because that's not normally the way around that we do these things.
I felt fairly confident because I trust you. There were moments when I was like, I hope this fits. But I just basically acted like the wood was the blade and operated on that assumption that it would all work out in the end.
You had some experience too, because that's exactly what you did with Arctic Fire 20.
Yeah, exactly. With 2013 we did that and it worked out great because we had Owen.
But I would just like to continue what you said there, because that's one of the more remarkable things with this, I think, because normally making hilt parts for a blade that you don't have, that's quite a bit of a gamble, because even though you might have a drawing and measurements, you're lacking the feedback of an actual blade and its volume, its presence and its weight and its size and its, and that's what the hilt is made for.
Right.
And in this case, you have a blade that is so far outside any reference or it's extremely, for me, it would be extremely difficult to visualize what a blade like that actually is and means.
Yeah.
And then to find somehow a way to make fittings that actually not just physically fit, but also, aesthetically, or just comes together into being a complete object, not just a huge piece of blade with huge pieces of hilt furniture. They should meet and marry.
That's it. Well,
that's quite an accomplishment.
I had no idea what we were going to get. That's the most interesting thing, is seeing the actual size of the piece.
It's
because I knew what it would look like from here. So that's the length of the blade that I had to work with, right? But the actual height of it, I think having this, understanding what this is, the width here, and having the hilt length, I had a sense of what the blade would be like, because it's very similar to a Viking sword. So, but I'm really happy that it worked out.
2 additional questions just came in. Short one from Josh Weston. Josh, member of Bladesmiths Forum, you probably recognize. What was the final weight of the pieces?
The guard weighs 12 pounds, the front guard, and the upper guard weighs 7 pounds. So, yeah, it's pretty heavy.
So heavier than most swords.
I put it in so I brought this here in my suitcase, and I put the fittings in my suitcase. I just had one suitcase, and it was so heavy that I was worried that if the suitcase dropped, it would just destroy the suitcase. So I brought it in its own suitcase. And they were much more concerned about that than me bringing swords in a suitcase. So.
And then Douglas McHale, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Douglas. An additional question, the actual joint between the steel blade and the bronze casting for the hilt is invisible as the bronze fits over the steel blade.
Right.
How is this joint fitted? If there is space and looseness, is it taken care of by having a bedding compound, in other words, some kind of tar, or the modern world, some kind of epoxy or caulk?
It's the way that it works is the blade comes in here and actually sits on the shoulders. The shoulders of the blade sit into the pocket in the guard. So the guard actually acts like a habaki on a Japanese sword. It fits right over the blade. And what they did historically is, if the blade had looseness, because a lot of times in historical swords, the hilts weren't necessarily forged for a specific blade. They weren't or forged by the same person that forged the blade. We have this idea now because of contemporary bladesmithing of sole authorship, where you make every part of the sword. But historically, these things were made by specialists. There was a specialist bladesmith, and he was probably in a group of bladesmiths who had a master who was giving advice to the smiths beneath him. And then those blades were maybe shipped out to a different kingdom where there was a hilt shop that hilted the sword. And the fittings don't actually always fit that well on swords. And what they would do is they would actually make little wedges and wedge the guard on from behind. And then there's a little bit of room for the blade to vibrate with the inside of this guard that fits over the shoulders of the blade.
Now you got it going.
Okay.
So follow-on question from Josh. Was there an estimation on weight of the blade for the hilt and the pommel to balance? In other words, did you kind of know ahead of time?
Right.
You guys, I imagine this was given some consideration.
Yeah, we thought that, well, the way that I view it is that your visual proportions usually work out in your weight proportions. So if you're visually balanced, and if you understand the sword form that you're working with, if it's visually balanced, it usually balances weight-wise, and then you can adjust it. But in this case, we thought you thought the blade was going to be like 80 pounds, right?
Well, originally I thought the whole sword would be 70.
Okay.
And the whole sword is 70.
Yeah.
Give or take a pound.
Yeah, and I thought it was going to be about, I expected the fittings would be about 20 pounds. So we actually were fairly close to our assessment of what it would be. And I was kind of thinking that I might be able to pick it up and put it on my shoulder. I didn't imagine that I was going to be able to use it. But it is so unwieldy and heavy because of it's a single-handed sword for a 12-foot tall man. And I'm a 6 foot tall, not even a 6 foot tall, I'm like 5'9", and it's just like, just picking it up. Yeah, you can kind of stand it up, and then carrying it, you have to hold it at the balance point and prop it on your leg. You might be able to take, if you had a bunch of assailants, you could really spin around and just like bang them with the sword. But I don't think it would really. The idea with the sword was to make it heavy enough so that nobody could actually use it unless they were kind of superhuman. And so it gives you this sense of like, it's an actual, it makes you have a huge amount of respect for how strong a giant must be and how awesome, and also how strong Beowulf must have been. It was really important to Owen to make it be a sword that was not easy to pick up for normal humans, so that it really felt like a real sword for giants. So he made it an inch thick. So the proportions, these proportions are, the proportions in outline are almost exactly ×2 of a sword that a human could use. Like if it was this tall, it would just be like a nice sword. But the proportions of its width, or its actual depth, its distal proportions are quite a bit larger because you're dealing with a giant. So a giant's stronger than a human. A giant isn't just twice as strong as a human, even though he's twice as big. He's like 10 times as strong as a human. So this has more mass in the blade, I think, than just double.
That's it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.